Hello, welcome to Unit 3 or Week 3 of the class. This week we have Memorial Day on Monday, and so the workload this week is a little bit lighter than the workload last week. Last week we tried to cover Aristotle, which was a lot. This week we're covering two other thinkers. We're going to read some shorter pieces by them, and we're going to have two lectures this week, probably two quizzes, a quiz on each person. There is already a reading posted in the modules, and that's what we're going to discuss today. This is the reading by Epicurus. And so Epicurus was a different philosopher, and we're proceeding chronologically. And so although the philosopher that we're going to discuss next, Epictetus, has a lot in common with Aristotle, Epicurus has less in common, but he came first. So he's from the island of Samos, which is an island in the Aegean Sea. His parents were Athenians. He was born in 341 BC, and he lived until 270 BC. And his philosophy really is a reaction against Platonism. So remember that Aristotle followed in the kind of lineage of Plato. Some very serious differences from Plato, but there was kind of one school there. And Epicurus is reacting against a lot of that. His philosophy in the kind of Hellenistic and Roman periods was very, very popular. There were largely two competing schools. One was the Epicurean school of philosophy, and the other was the Stoic school of philosophy, which we're going to be discussing in the next lecture. So Epicurus was very important. And then with the rise of Christianity, he became very unpopular. His doctrines were, I think, rather misunderstood. And he kind of acquired this kind of cast of like a villain almost with his philosophy. But we're going to see that maybe that was not well deserved. Like Plato and Aristotle, Epicurus started a philosophical school. His school was called the Garden. And notably, especially considering, this was in the 3rd century BC, his school admitted both women and slaves, which is something that the other schools were not doing at that time. We did not read what Aristotle had to say about slavery and what Aristotle had to say about the difference of the sexes. We have records of that. If you want to go and look up Aristotle, I can point you in the right direction. He was not opposed to slavery, and he did not believe in the equality of the sexes. Epicurus seems to have believed more in the equality of people than his contemporaries did. So that, I think, says something kind of positive about him. Notably, Epicurus is really the first atheist philosopher, and this is kind of what he's known for, is disregarding the gods. So it's unclear whether he didn't believe in the gods at all or just believed that the gods were kind of irrelevant to his life. But he had no fear of death because he didn't believe in the gods and he didn't believe in an afterlife. So his position on death was that death was nothing to be feared because it's nothing that's ever actually experienced. His thinking was that you experience the time before you die, but then when you die, when you stop living, you're not there, you're not present to experience that. So death is something that's never really experienced. Only life is experienced. And because of this, he was unafraid of death. And a lot of his philosophy flows from being unafraid of death. And so what we have to discuss today, you're going to start right off there with not being afraid of death, is this list of about 40 propositions. We're going to discuss some of them in more detail and some of them in less detail. And this is a collection of the principal doctrines of Epicurus, and it comes down to us, and it gives us a really good representation of what he thought. Epicurus, even though after the fall of Rome, his influence waned, what we will find later in the course is once we get to consequentialist ethical theories like utilitarianism, and we start talking about the ethical theories of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries, that they really do look back to Epicurus as something of an early originator of utilitarianism. So his philosophy is actually it's pretty important in the grand scheme of things. So we, even though we're not reading as much by him, I think that he's really it's critical to get an understanding of what he says. It's because he's got a powerful influence on later thinkers, and those later thinkers are very they inform our ethical thinking in the early 21st century in a very powerful way. So let's begin. So we're looking at the principal doctrines, and again, this is on a module. There's a file there under Unit 3, and I think it's just called Epicurus Reading, and it's broken down into these paragraphs. There's a list of 40 of them, so we'll talk about them by number. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to talk about a number of them. So he starts off right away in number 1. A happy and eternal being has no trouble himself and brings no trouble upon any other being. Hence, he is exempt from movements of anger and partiality, for every such movement implies weakness. Now, this is a philosophy of religion proposition, right? He's talking about what would the qualities of a God be, right? So if you have a God who supposedly is happy and eternal, then that would be a being that would have no trouble and would bring no trouble, right? Because he would be exempt, being eternal and happy. He wouldn't be angry, he wouldn't be partial, he wouldn't be jealous, he wouldn't be greedy, he wouldn't be avaricious, he wouldn't be subject to these all of these human flaws that are kind of brought on by scarcity, like fear of bad health, fear of bad fortune, fear of death, right? There's a lot of the motivations for human behavior. The gods, of course, would not be subject to these. And so we wouldn't need to worry about them. See, so this is what is later kind of labeled as his atheism, and that, like I said, it's not clear that he was an atheist, but certainly he didn't think about the gods in the same way as the Greeks. So if we are to go ahead and read some of the Greek religious texts, the Theogony by Hesiod or the Homeric epics, either the Iliad or the Odyssey, we see that the gods are very much concerned about the affairs of human beings and very much subject to things like movements of anger and partiality. And Epicurus is saying the gods aren't like that. How do we know their gods aren't like that? Well, let's just think about what a god is. A god is a happy and eternal being, so we should not have any trouble with them. Right? And then he immediately follows this by what we had already were talking a little bit about death. Number 2, he says, death is nothing to us, for the body, when it has been resolved into its elements, has no feeling, and that which has no feeling is nothing to us. So once death comes, whatever it is that we are, we're not present. So death is something that is never actually experienced. We experience the process of dying, but once we get to the part that it's the death itself, we're not present to experience it because we've died. This is really a great liberating thought for the Epicureans. This idea that we do not have to be afraid of death. So 2 main principles. We do not have to be afraid of the gods. We do not have to be afraid of death. So what does that leave us with? Proposition 3. The magnitude of pleasure reaches its limit in the removal of all pain. When pleasure is present, so long as it is uninterrupted, there is no pain either of the body or of the mind or of both together. Right? So Epicurus and all of his ethical thinking is based upon pleasure and pain. Human beings seek pleasure and try to avoid pain. That's what our motivators are. Right? And what we want to do is we want to have a pleasant life. And really Epicurus is saying, and in here he's defining pleasure as the removal of pain. So once all pain is removed, that is the most pleasant state that there is. So again, this is not a state of euphoria, right? But it's something that's kind of more calm. Because if we have a pleasure that kind of manifests in a way that's manic, that brings pain with it. So what is more pleasurable is to have this kind of calm, steady state, right? And this brings us to point 4. It says, continuous pain does not last long in the body. On the contrary, pain, if extreme, is present only a short time. And even that degree of pain, which barely outweighs pleasure in the body, does not last for many days together. Illnesses of long duration even permit an excess of pleasure over pain in the body. And I think also this is something that we recognize, right? Most of us don't really mind a sick day, because when we're too sick to go out and do our work, what do? We stay home, we rest, and then we might even be able to take up an occupation that we really enjoy. We might be able to pull that novel off the shelf that we have been wanting to get to for a long time, and even find that in our sickness, we may have enjoyed that time sick and convalescing more so than we would have if we had gone to work or school on that day. Right? So this is something I think that's familiar to us even from childhood. Right? Even from childhood, there is sometimes when the pain of the body came, in the course of the illness, it was more pleasant than if it hadn't come. Right? And then number 5, and this brings us to something of a conclusion, and this is something that we're going to come back to again and again and again. Number 5, he says, it is impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and well and justly. And it is impossible to live wisely and well and justly without living pleasantly. Whenever any one of these is lacking, when, for instance, the person is not able to live wisely, though he lives well and justly, it is impossible for him to live a pleasant life. So Epicurus often is accused of being a philosopher of hedonism. So what does that mean? Well, Epicurus, we actually have a word in our language called epicure, right? And so what is an epicure? Well, an epicure is some sort of gourmand, right? Somebody who's into fine foods and the pleasures of the palate, right? That's what an epicure is. And this goes back to Epicurus. It goes back to his name, because he, for a long time, this is especially true during the Middle Ages, when Christianity was the kind of the most ascendant tradition in our society. For a long time, Epicurus was labeled as this philosopher of hedonism, where what he was concerned with was trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And if you read Epicurus, you can see that there's some basis for this. He does want people to live lives where they're maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. But that doesn't fit well with what he's just said here in this proposition 5, right? It's impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely, well, and justly. So the pleasant man is wise, well, and just. What does this mean? How can we break this down? Well, the pleasant man, right, which is not the hedonistic man, but the man who is the most free of pain, right? Because the absence of pain is what pleasure is defined as in Epicurus. So the pleasant man is wise. That means that he is concerned with developing the faculties of the mind, right? He has kind of an elevated intellect. He is a person who reads. He's a person who keeps aware of the current events. He's a person who's involved in the pursuits of culture. He's a lover of art and a lover of music and a lover of poetry. These kinds of pleasures that really are not hedonistic, but if we look at it through a hedonistic lens, we might even call them sedate, because he's a wise man. He's one whose mind is active and exercised. So he lives wisely. And then what does it mean to live well? Well, that means to concentrate and to focus some of our attention upon the health of the body, but I would also say the health of the body and the mind, right? A person who is well is a person who exercises, a person who eats well, a person who doesn't eat to excess, maybe who's not an epicure, right? Not overly concerned with the sensations of the palate, but more concerned with the health of the body. And that's different than a lot of people's preconceptions about Epicurus, that the person who is well is more pleasant. So the one who goes for a walk every day or takes some exercise, the one who doesn't sleep excessively. And then if you're also going to have a well body, that means that you're not going to be abusing substances, right? You're not going to be drinking to excess and getting the attendant hangover that comes with it, right? You're not going to be eating to excess and getting the poor health that comes with it. You're going to be attending to the wellness of your body, and that's going to make you temperate. It will not lead to hedonism, but it is actually in fact going to lead to a more temperate lifestyle, because the pleasant man is wise and well. And then the third element is just. The pleasant man is just, wise, well, and just. And what does this mean? Well, this speaks to the relations that a person is going to have with their neighbors, right? Because we know that pleasure is the absence of pain, and that oftentimes our pain comes from our fellow human beings, right? We know this especially when the person, say, in front of us is not driving very well, that we experience a lot of pain at the hand of our fellow human being, right? Of course, Epicurus didn't drive, but I mean, he had neighbors, right? He had neighbors, and he knew that neighbors are a source of pain. These relationships that we have in our lives can cause us some distress. They can cause us emotional distress, spiritual distress, distress of the soul, and physical pain and distress also. So it's important to be just, right? What he means by justice is treating the people around you justly, giving them what they are due, being polite and courteous, making an effort to live well with them together. And why? Well, because he wants to have a life that's absent of pain. And so he has these three elements, right? To live wisely, well, and justly. These are the necessary elements of living the pleasant life. Because if any one of them is missing, then our life is going to be, will have more pain. So, for example, if you live wisely and justly, but neglect your body, right, your life is going to be full of more aches and pains. You're going to be overweight or flabby, or you're not going to you're going to be easily winded. It's not going to be good for you. You're going to spend more time than otherwise dealing with the physical pains of the body. And that's going to prevent you from having a pleasant life. And the same could be said of any of them. If you live wisely and well, but not justly, then your fellow human beings are going to bring pain into your life. So this really is a summation of the doctrine of Epicurus. I would say that this proposition number 5 is one of the more important ones that we're going to see here in this list of 40. Right? Now, number 8, we're gonna get a little bit better of idea on how his whole philosophy is developed. He says, no pleasure is in itself evil, but the things which produce certain pleasures entail annoyances many times greater than the pleasures themselves. Right, now I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, so there might be a blip here. I got to take care of something really quick, and I'll be back. Okay, I think that might have been a little bit glitchy there, but we're back. My dog decided that she needed to come into my room and take a nap, so she's doing that now. So we were talking about number eight. Number eight on our list of the principal doctrines of Epicurus. And it says, no pleasure is in itself evil, but the things which produce certain pleasures entail annoyances many times greater than the pleasures themselves. So he's kind of, and this is where he's different than a lot of the other moral thinkers, right? He's saying that nothing really is good or bad in itself. And this is very, very different than what somebody like Immanuel Kant, who we're going to get to in 2 weeks, very different from what he would say. But things are good and bad because of the result that they have on us. And this is the kind of thing that kind of connects him to the utilitarians that are going to adopt him later, right, as kind of their progenitor. That nothing is good and bad in itself, nothing's evil in itself, but it's because certain things produce annoyances many times greater than the pleasure. And so, you could think here about the pleasures of like, say, the consumption of alcohol would be one that you could think of, that it brings with it a certain pleasure. But if you have too much of that, it's going to bring with it the annoyance of the hangover, right? The annoyance of the hangover, which is, of course, a great pain. And, we can also think of maybe other pleasures of the body, right? Which could bring with them, in some cases, disease, which is a pain, literally. In some cases, they could bring unwanted children. And these things are going to be a source of suffering to us. Right? And so this is where he's coming from. He's always looking kind of to the result, and how does the action that I'm doing, what does the result of that action mean for the pain that I'm suffering? Because Epicurus is trying to get us to a state where we are pain-free, where we're not suffering from pain, and we're living wisely, well, and justly. Okay, let's look at number 10. It said, number 10, if the objects which are productive of pleasures to profligate persons really freed them from fears of the mind, the fears, I mean, inspired by celestial and atmospheric phenomena, the fear of death, the fear of pain. If further they taught them how to limit their desires, we should never have any fault to find with such persons, for they would then be filled with pleasures to overflowing on all sides, and would be exempt from all pain, whether of body or mind, that which is from all evil. So let's unpack that a little bit, because this is really, it's saying the same thing as we've just read in number 8, but number 10 is going to get kind of into more details. So he introduces this term here, the pleasures of the profligate person. And by this, he means like the hedonistic pleasure, the one who kind of eats and drinks his way through his inheritance, right? The one who's only interested in pleasures of the body. This is what he's talking about when he talks about the pleasures of profligate persons. And so he's saying here that if the objects which are productive of the pleasures to profligate persons really freed them from fears of the mind, right? So we're talking about if alcohol, if eating to excess, if sexual libertinism really did what these people say, and we might add in our time, smoking a lot of marijuana, if it really did what these people say, which is to fear them from free them from the fears of the mind, and he clarifies. He says inspired by celestial and atmospheric phenomena, right? So heavenly, celestial is heavenly. So heavenly phenomena and like storms and stuff like that. But I mean, we have to keep in mind that he's a Greek, and if you have atmospheric phenomena, what that means is that Zeus is up there throwing those thunderbolts down, right? And we might not share that, but we might have, a lot of us, a fear of damnation, right? That we kind of acquire or inherit from our previously Christian civilization, and these pleasures of profligate persons don't free us from those fears, But then he talks about the fear of death and the fear of pain. And I think that all of us have that. All of us have the fear of death and the fear of pain. And one of the things that we know about human beings is that a lot of times they will engage in these pleasures of the profligates to try to escape those fears, to try to escape the fear of death and to try to escape the fear of pain. They might try to drink themselves into a state in which they're numb, right? But that doesn't work. It keeps coming back. It's not an effective strategy. It doesn't actually have the result that you want. And Epicurus knows this. But he says, and if further they taught them to limit their desires, we should never have any fault to find with such persons. Right? If these profligate pleasures were the kind of things that led people to live lives that were wise, well, and just, then we wouldn't have problems with it. We wouldn't have problems with those things. And so what is he doing here? Well, temperance is a big thing. Temperance is a big question in ethics and morality. And he's saying that temperance is not important for the reason that you think it is. It's important because the temperate person is the one who is the happiest because his life is the most free from pain, right? The most free from pain. Let's skip down to number 14, right? So number 14, he says, when tolerable security against our fellow humans is attained, right? What is tolerable security against your fellow humans? Well, it means living justly with them. It means that you are respecting their property and their persons, and they are respecting your property and your persons. So when you're living in a society that's functioning according to justice, that is tolerable security against your fellow human beings. It says, and then on a basis of power sufficient to afford supports and of material prosperity arises in most genuine form the security of a quiet, private life withdrawn from the multitude. So what is he after? Well, I really think in a lot of ways he's after something like the life that a lot of people in our community have. What do we have in our community? Well, we certainly have more security against our fellow human beings than in a lot of other places. We have here in our community, and in Hancock, we have a very low crime rate, right? We have a very low rate of violent crime. People here are secure, right? And it's not only that we have a certain level of material prosperity. I mean, we're not wealthy here. I mean, we don't have a lot of great jobs here, but one of the things that we do have is we have a lower cost of living. And so there are a lot of people here who can afford a modest home because homes are not that expensive, and we're not starving. And in Michigan, we've got a decent healthcare system even for the poor. So we have, power sufficient to afford supports and of material prosperity that arises in the most genuine form. And so then what do we get from that? We get the security of a quiet, private life withdrawn from the multitude. Right? Epicurus thinks, I think he would be shocked at the size of some of our cities. I mean, every ancient person would be shocked at the size of some of our cities. The idea of 1 million people living in a small space is something that I don't think ever occurred to any of them. But what he's advocating for is a life on a smaller scale, a life where you know the neighbors who are around you, and a life that's not continually interrupted by strangers, right? Because if you have a life that's continually interrupted by strangers, people you don't know, it's harder to figure out how to live justly with them. And I have to pause this one more time, so I do apologize. Okay, sorry for the interruption. It's Sunday afternoon. I've got a lot of busy stuff going on. That was my neighbor calling. We're working on a project at the park. So back to Epicurus. So this is what he's looking for. This is what he thinks is the ideal life, is this one that is lived on a smaller scale, and one that is quiet. And when I read that, a quiet, private life withdrawn from the multitude, I think I really think that our existence here in smaller communities, kind of withdrawn from the multitude and the hustle and bustle of the larger cities, is something like what he has in mind. That this is the kind of existence that might be most likely to be free from pain. Let's take a look now at number 16. He says here, fortune but seldom interferes with the wise person. His greatest and highest interests have been, are, and will be directed by reason through the course of his life. So what is that? Well, that's just nothing more than a support for his previous statement that the pleasant life is one that is wise, well, and just. Right? And then at number 17, he is supporting one of those other, 16, he supports 16, he supports the wise part, and in 17, he's going to support the just part, right? The just person enjoys the greatest peace of mind, while the unjust is full of the utmost disquietude. Why? Because the just person is one who is not ever at enmity with his neighbors. The just person is one who is at peace with everyone and is not going to disturb him. Number 19, he's looking at something a little bit different, right? So he's taking a look at pleasure, and what it is, and this excuse me, and this is something that you can work into his broader philosophy. It says, unlimited time and limited time afford an equal amount of pleasure if we measure the limits of that pleasure by reason. Now, this is something that's kind of counterintuitive to us, because what do we think? Well, we think that if I had a pleasurable time for longer, there would be more pleasure there than the pleasurable time for shorter. But he's saying that if you look at it reasonably, this is not how it works. This is not how rationality applies to this. And I think really what he's getting at is that we don't have to worry about having a longer life or a shorter life. What we need to worry about is having a pleasant life. And a pleasant life that is short is going to be better than a longer life that is unpleasant. Okay? Number 20, he unpacks some of the same concept. The body receives as unlimited the limits of pleasure, and to provide it requires unlimited time. But the mind, grasping in thought what the end and limit of the body is, and banishing the terrors of futurity, procures a complete and perfect life, and has no longer any need of unlimited time. Nevertheless, it does not shun pleasure, and even in the hour of death, when ushered out of existence by circumstances, the mind does not lack enjoyment of the best life. Interestingly enough, we see this in the death of Epicurus himself. Right? Epicurus actually died a painful death. He died of a kidney stone that he was not able to pass. So he had like this urinary tract blockage, and it was very, very painful. But what he attended to in his last days were the pleasures of the mind, right? Which are more substantial than the pleasures of the body. And he spent this time with friends in conversation, talking about the higher things, talking about philosophy. Right? Let's skip down to number 27. Right? Number 27, he says, of all the means which are procured by wisdom to ensure happiness throughout the whole life, by far the most important is the acquisition of friends. Right? This should not be, if we've been listening to and we've been attentive to what he's been saying so far, this should not be surprising to us, right? Of all of the means which are procured to ensure happiness, the most important is the acquisition of friends. Well, that goes with living wisely, well, and justly, right? Having friends is part of living justly because you are interacting with other people. And friendship is pleasant. So we have here another philosopher talking about the importance of friendship. This is going to go away with the Stoics, I think, somewhat, and it stays away for a long time. And it really has only been in the 20th century. Um, and it it's always part of virtue ethics and it's always part of utilitarianism, but the philosophers don't really speak much about friendship between the ancient world and the 20th century. And then in the 20th century, some people start to talk about it again. But there's this concept in these ancient philosophers, both in Epicurus and in Aristotle, that friendship is of critical importance to living the good life. And living the good life is what ethics really is all about. It's about that for Aristotle, but Aristotle's got this perspective that it's about achieving kind of the human telos, the end. Um, Epicurus is much kind of more utilitarian about it, but they both come to the same conclusion that friends are necessary for this happiness to happen. Right? They're necessary for this happiness to happen. Let's take a look at page 31. Not page 31. Proposition 31. Natural justice is a symbol or expression of usefulness to prevent one person from harming or being harmed by another. Well, this is pretty much a straight expression of utilitarianism. So we have this idea of natural justice, and it shows up in earlier moral codes, pre-philosophical moral codes. And it shows up also in virtue ethics because justice is one of the virtues. But what he's saying is that this is a symbol or an expression of utility, right? This principle is not good in itself, but it is useful because it prevents people from harming one another and being harmed, right? We're living justly to avoid pain. Let's look at number 33, right? There never was an absolute justice, but only an agreement made in reciprocal association in whatever localities now and again, from time to time, providing against the infliction or suffering of harm. Right? So he's going to disagree. He's going to disagree with Plato. He's going to disagree with Aristotle. Both of them think that there really is a natural justice, an absolute justice. Certainly he's going to disagree with Kant, who will come later, that there's idea that there's this absolute natural justice. And he's saying, no, these systems of justice that we find, that we encounter in the world, these are systems of justice that are utilitarian at heart. Right? We have them because they are useful in preventing harm to one another. And what is that? Harm is the corporate avoidance of pain. It's the avoidance of pain by the whole community. And this is further explicated in number 34. Injustice is not itself an evil, but only in its consequence. Right? Injustice itself is not an evil, but only in its consequence. So we're going to find that this is fundamentally opposed to a deontological type scheme of ethics, because the injustice is only evil because of its consequence. And he says, namely, the terror which is excited by apprehension that those appointed to punish such offenses will discover the injustice. So again, we have in 33 a statement that justice is utilitarian and that injustice is also utilitarian. Right? So there's not any absolutes in Epicurus. And this is part of the reason why after the ascendancy of Christianity, it saw a decline in, I don't want to say a decline in adherence because it's a philosophy. People don't really adhere to philosophies, but it had a decline in popularity, right? Because in the Christian system, there's all kinds of things that are absolute. And in the Epicurean system, Nothing is absolute. It's only known as what it is by its utility or lack of utility. And those things can change over time and according to circumstances. Okay? Let's look at number 38, and it's going to unpack this a little bit more. It says, where without any change in circumstances, the conventional laws, when judged by their consequences, were seen not to correspond with the notion of justice, such laws were not really just. But wherever the laws have ceased to be useful in consequence of a change of circumstance, in that case the laws were for the time being just when they were useful for the mutual association of citizens, and subsequently ceased to be just when they ceased to be useful. And so what do we have there? Well, it's more of an expression of utilitarianism, right? Things are just and unjust depending upon the circumstances that the society or the individual finds himself in. How are they useful? How do they work to the promotion of pleasure, which is the absence of pain? How do they prevent pain? How do they soothe pain? These are the questions that are important. We don't have absolutes in Epicurus. We only have relatives. Okay. And that really is about all we need to say about Epicurus and Epicureanism. Again, what are the takeaways? What's important? Well, the first thing that's really important is that Epicurus was not afraid of death. That's really important to know. He was not afraid of the gods. That's really important to know. He did not believe in absolutes. That's really important to know. He believed that what was good was the thing that promoted pleasure and avoided pain. He also believed that what was the most pleasant thing, the most pleasurable thing, was the thing that avoided the most pain. This is why he does not believe in the pleasures of the profligate persons, because those pleasures bring attendant pains with them. And the final thing that you need to understand for Epicurus is the person who lives the pleasant life, right? So one who's doing it right is wise, well, and just. He has an active mind, a healthy body, and good relationships with his neighbors. These are the things, when taken together, that help us to avoid the most pain. And they're good, not in themselves, but because they have a positive consequence for the person who's doing them. Okay, so that is our lecture on Epicurus. If you have any questions, go ahead and get in touch with me. There will be a quiz on Epicurus that will appear later. And also there will be a video on Epictetus, which will appear later. And Epictetus is very different. And the lecture on Epictetus, we will not only discuss Epictetus, we're also going to be discussing Zeno of Citius, who was the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. So until next time.